I used to do that in the state legislature, so it's nice. So it's nice to be back. Welcome, everybody. We are now in the first Energy and Mineral Resources Subcommittee in the 116th Congress. I want to welcome everyone. I am really looking forward to all of us working together. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on climate change and preparing for the transition to a clean energy economy. Now, this is where we're starting from today. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to myself as the chairperson and to the ranking minority member, or my dear friend, Mr. Gosar. I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record, and if they are submitted to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. To begin with, I'd like to thank my partner, and congratulate Ranking Member Gosar on his subcommittee leadership position. We've developed a good relationship. I served as the ranking member with Mr. Gosar previously, and I found it very positive. I think we work very well together, not always agreeing on things, but we work together well on things. We also have mutual likes, tamales, coffee, as I just took, some, and also as opportunities to work together on this committee. And I look forward to sharing with members of this committee ways we can work to find out how we can work together. And I'm going to mention one of those things in this statement. I think I haven't checked with the anyone in the Capitol, the historians, but I think this is the only subcommittee with both the chair and the ranking member who are doctorates but don't have a doctorate in jurisprudence. We're a psychologist and a dentist. Exactly what the Congress needs at this moment. It's a psychologist. But I want to talk, before I turn to the topic of today's hearing, I think I'm trying to set a stage to emphasize that even though we're not going to have any shortage of policy disagreements on this subcommittee, it's my intention to run it in ways that keeps discussions thoughtful, respectful, based upon facts, not putting people down, and with an eye to wherever we can find agreement, let's go for it. If we can't find agreement, let's respect each other and understand that's where. This subcommittee, is going to have a tremendously important role in our country's debate over energy and climate. I know it's doubted by some of my colleagues. I think that's their position where they're starting, not all, who say we have no jurisdiction over climate change and no reason to discuss it. Well, I think I totally disagree with that point of view, and I think that's just not right. In addition to the tremendous impacts from climate change that are affecting our public lands, these lands are responsible for really nearly 1/4 of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions come from what we have jurisdiction over. They're also home to some of the best renewable resources in the country, if not in this planet. We have jurisdiction over. We're talking about geothermal, we're talking about large-scale solar, we're talking about major offshore wind, which is beginning to become a reality. So, managing our nation's vast energy resources, addressing the health and the environmental impacts of energy production, and understanding the role of public lands in mitigating climate change are just some of the few of the issues. I want this committee to be a forum where we can discuss these issues and develop solutions that have the buy-in from the communities across the country, because we're really talking about beginning to embark on an adventure where we will not solve it all here. We have to have buy-in from our communities. In the coming weeks, I look forward to meeting with individuals on this committee to get to know them, to discuss your goals and priorities. But I've also talked to my ranking member about maybe periodic, maybe once a quarter, having an off-the-record, informal, no press, no public prepared statements, way of getting to know each other, whether they're round tables, we can find some place, or where we can really hear each other's story. What are you passionate about? What do you want to do? Why are you here? So, the more you know each other's story, the more difficult it is to dehumanize in this situation. We have enough differences that we don't need to dehumanize each other in that process. And we need to hear and respect where people are coming. And plus, it makes it the most enjoyable parts of a committee if we kind of know the other members and why they're here and it makes the formal aspects, which we'll be focusing on and having, I think, more interesting to do and more fun. So I'm kind of, when I meet with you individually, want to ask you about some. We're not going to do a lot of them, but we're going to do some where it's off the record, folks. You come when you want to come. You don't prepare anything. You want to share who you are and who you are in relationship to some of these issues that are important to you and your community, not to the committee or to anybody else. So I really look forward to that. And plus, Paul said he's going to help us with making sure we have the tamales and the coffee. So we're going to work on that. I would also like to give a warm welcome to our witnesses and thank them for testifying this morning. This month in the entire Natural Resources Committee, we're discussing the impacts of climate change, whether it's tribes we're talking about, oceans, national parks, forests, wildlife. All of these are seeing huge consequences, and I think from most people's perspective, which just the worst is yet to come. There must be changes in how we produce and use energy in this country. And there's no doubt that a transition away from fossil fuels to zero-emission energy sources is essential if we're to leave a recognizable world for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. They are usually not at the table, but these are issues that they have to be considered at the table from now on, that anything that we do has to understand how it's going to have that impact. I think this transition has to happen quickly. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle may not feel the same urgency. That's why we have different, not that they're any different, but they may not feel the same urgencies. They may not worry, or they may have different concerns about the disruption of jobs and what this means for the economy, or that their local economies will be greatly affected, or it doesn't really impact them as much. I hope in this, using kind of science and listening to each other, that we grow more, I think that we come closer in looking that we don't have a lot of time. Time is not on our side, and that we need to figure out what we can work together on and how we can move forward. One of the things I think we all are going to agree upon is the need to help the people that are most impacted by that transition, that there are going to be different parts of the country that are going to be impacted the most, and we don't want to leave people out of that transition. And what is happening is, this is not new, We've already gone through, in 1943, we had over 500,000 coal miners in the country, 130,000 in West Virginia alone. And for decades, Appalachia and the workers and families that called this region home supplied the U.S. with coal that kept the lights on, powered the world's largest economy, and were instrumental in winning the Second World War and protecting democracy. So we're talking about something that is part of the nation's fabric. But today, there are barely 1/10 as many coal mining jobs. It's not been due to government policies. It's because of the sense of the economics that's going on, automation that's going on, and other alternatives. But the cause of it is irrelevant. What's really relevant, I think, right now, not that it's all irrelevant, what causes things it's not, but the real thing is the effect is that there are out-of-work coal miners. Their families are unsure what they're going to do for a living. And whole communities practically vanishing. And if we use as the mantra, the solution is to provide false hope that there's going to be a resurrection of coal, we're not doing our responsibility. We're not acting responsibly. The solution is going to be to provide new opportunities for these workers and new options for towns to grow and thrive. As we move towards clean energy, other regions of the country are going to be impacted in different way, and we're going to have to understand how we're going to deal with that as in federal. Some areas are already preparing for this. Wyoming, major coal-producing state in the nation, just recently released an ambitious 20-year plan to diversify their economy and to reduce the state's over-reliance on coal. But we do have doubters and those who think we should be doubling down now on fossil fuel. I think, personally, that's a recipe for even more hardship if we double down. Whether it's because of climate change, resource depletion, normal boom or bust cycles of fuel prices, putting all your chips on fossil fuels, I think now is a bad bet, and we need to at least address those issues. We need to support American communities and workers with the same effort and urgencies that we need to confront climate change. And I think that there's one sense that we're hearing is there's an urgency to what we do, and we have to deal with that. I now thank you, and I recognize the opening, and I will assure you in the future I will not talk this long.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and yes, my good friend, Dr. Lowenthal, brings a smile every morning, and as a recovering dentist, I will tell you, a smile tells me everything I need to know. A smile tells me you're happy with yourself, you're willing to engage. If you're willing to engage, you're willing to communicate. If you're willing to communicate, you can solve a problem. So if you want to solve a problem, smile. So thank you again, and thank the witnesses for being here. Now, before I get into my opening statement, Mr. Chairman, I would like to reflect on the majority's noncompliance with Committee Rule 4C by failing to provide a public memo on the scope of today's hearing. Without a memo, the public is kept in the dark, and members of this committee are unable to prepare for the informed debate. I ask my Democrat colleagues to please return to a transparent process so that we can do the deliberative work of this body in a more effective manner. I think my colleagues on both sides of the aisle would agree that legislating shouldn't be done in the dark. Now for the matter at hand. The title of this hearing, Climate Change, Preparing for the Energy Transition, implies our country is on the cusp of a sweeping transformation into a green economy, and that communities with vibrant energy economies today should plan accordingly. This implication is manifested by the dramatic socialist resolution that was introduced last week, the Green New Deal. This proposal calls for net zero emissions in the next 10 years through federal mandates, 100% clean and renewable energy, a phase-out of plane travel, and according to the bill's accidentally uploaded frequently asked questions, guaranteed economic security for all those unable or unwilling to work. This is just what it sounds like, a socialist fairy tale, right up there with, if you like your health plan, care plan, you can keep it. Let me be clear, though the Green New Deal may not be our primary topic today, the majority will see this hearing to bolster the case for why and how we can replace six-figure energy jobs with bioenergetic hemp farms and wind-powered coffee shops through a federal takeover of the country. Indeed, many members of this committee have co-sponsored this radical resolution, including the chairman of the committee, Mr. Grijalva, as well as my friend and chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Lowenthal, and fellow subcommittee members, Mr. Huffman and Mr. Neguse. We will hear testimony today from several witnesses regarding their efforts to create jobs in the Appalachia and the Mountain West outside of the fossil fuel industry. I appreciate their efforts and their commitment to getting Americans back to work, particularly after so many Americans were laid off from their high-paying energy jobs after the regulatory assault of the previous administration. I do believe there are wonderful opportunities that can help regions that are dependent on traditional sources to diversify their economies and to prevent devastation afflicting regions like Appalachia due to failed federal mandates. Despite what the majority's intent with this hearing, I want to assure the American people about our energy economy and its importance for the foreseeable future. From the 10.3 million jobs in the U.S. supported by the oil and gas economy to the geopolitical certainty we can provide our European, Asian, and other allies, and to continue domestic investments such as ExxonMobil's announcement last week of a $10 billion LNG export facility in Texas, conventional energy sources have played an overwhelmingly positive role in defining our country. Innovation in these fields has reduced emissions at the same time production has increased. Moreover, energy demand in the United States and around the world is strong. The void left by America, best believed, would be filled by opportunistic countries with far worse environmental standards if the U.S. exited the conventional energy market. Even saying that these words feel ridiculous, but these are strange times. Let's take a moment to talk about what a green economy really means. If I may borrow a term, an inconvenient truth about renewable energy is the need for vast amounts of critical minerals and rare earth elements to make them work. For example, wind power requires neodymium and dysprosium, and demand for these minerals is expected to go up by 700% to 2,600%, while solar panels rely almost solely on minerals from the United States, currently imports from countries like China, despite being a nation blessed with many of the resources that can be mined here. In the last several years, America has experienced an energy renaissance. U.S. natural gas, oil production, and exports are at record levels. In 2017, the U.S. also led the world in carbon emissions reductions. This occurred because of American ingenuity and in spite of anti-energy policies of the previous administration and seemingly the agenda of the new House majority. Delusional federal mandates proposed in the Green New Deal will only topple America's dominance in the energy economy, creating unemployment, high energy costs, and weakening our position globally. It would be a mass tax and a mass displacement of the poorest among us. My Democratic colleagues in the past have claimed to support an all-the-above energy strategy. Turns out this was just an election year talking point, as many now wage war on nuclear energy, natural gas, and even hydropower. The irony with the Green New Deal's facts page proposing an end to the use of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is one of the cleanest and most reliable sources in America. I'm glad we are able to highlight the good work our witnesses are doing back in Appalachia and across the country, but we should be discussing ways to remove red tape, empower job creators, pursue innovative technologies that bolster our strong status as the leader in emissions reductions. If the majority has their way and the policies of the Green Dream somehow are magically enacted, then the economic plight of Appalachia will be a microcosm for the rest of our great nation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. You won't be a co-sponsor.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, now I'd like to...
You can probably take that to the bank.
Thank you, Paul. Now I'd like to introduce today's witnesses. But first I'd like to ask unanimous consent for Congressman Case and Congressman Neguse to sit on the dais and participate in this morning's hearings. Hearing no objections, so ordered. Now I'm going to introduce our first witness. First, we have Chandra Farley. Ms. Farley is the director of Just Energy, the Just Energy program for the Partnership for Southern Equity. Our second panelist is Sarah Schrader. Ms. Schrader. Ms. Schrader is the owner and co-founder of Bonsai Design and the president of the Outdoor Recreation Coalition of the Grand Valley. Next, we have Dr. Bill Bissett. Dr. Bissett is the president and the CEO of the Huntington Regional Chamber of Commerce. Our fourth witness is Peter Hilley. Mr. Hilley is the president of the Mountain Association for Community Economic Development. Our fifth witness is Brandon Dennison. Mr. Dennison is the founder and the CEO of Coalfield Development Corporation. Coalfield Development Corporation. And finally, we have Dr. Joseph Mason. Dr. Mason is a professor in the Department of Finance at the Louisiana State University. Let me remind our witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table That in front will turn green, and that after 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will then have expired after 1 more minute when the red light comes on, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I'm also going to allow the entire panel to testify before questioning members of our up here on the dais before we begin questioning. I will now recognize Ms. Farley to testify. Welcome.
Thank you. Honorable Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the House Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources. Thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Chandra Farley, and I am the Just Energy Director at the Partnership for Southern Equity based in Atlanta, Georgia. I am honored to provide this testimony in support of a just and equitable transition to the clean energy economy. We know with data-informed certainty that systematically disenfranchised, under-resourced communities and communities of color in the South bear a disproportionate burden of the negative impacts of the changing climate and carbon-based energy production. 3 of the top 5 biggest carbon polluters are in the South. This is compounded by the fact that 4 southern cities, Memphis, Birmingham, Atlanta, and New Orleans, hold the greatest energy burdens for low-income households, but face the greatest barriers to weatherization assistance and energy efficiency programs that can reduce these high burdens. Also, the Southeast region serves as home to 84% of all U.S. counties that experience persistent poverty. This is defined as a county in which at least 20% of the population experiences poverty for 3 decades or more. Pile on the fact that the South experiences a higher frequency of billion-dollar weather and climate disaster events than any other region, we can begin to contextualize the constant struggle and mounting barriers that historically marginalized communities face in this era of changing climate and rapid energy transition. Despite bearing an inequitable portion of negative impacts due to climate change and carbon-based energy production, disenfranchised communities are virtually unrepresented in the energy planning and decision-making processes that drive inequitable outcomes in energy regulation, distribution, and policy. While unfamiliar to many citizens, these policies significantly impact household economic stability and impinge upon the overall quality of our air, water, and other natural resources that affect our health and well-being. Directly related to the health and well-being stressors of carbon-based energy production is the rising cost of energy. The resulting energy burden, or percentage of household income spent on energy bills, is a crippling financial burden for working families. According to the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy, the energy burden on African American and Latino households with lower incomes is up to 3 times as high as others. When you consider that the median energy burden in the ACEEE sample was 3.5%, we can see the paralyzing effects of increasing energy costs on many families' ability to thrive. With limited funding for weatherization assistance programs and financial barriers to cost-saving energy efficiency upgrades, the mounting costs of energy bills translate to unimaginable choices for our working families and senior citizens. Do you pay the light bill and go without your medicine? Or do you buy groceries or heat your home? Collectively, these conditions stem from the underlying forces of structural and institutional racism that are embedded in our land use policies and energy systems. From the siting of carbon-based energy production facilities and the resulting negative health impacts, to the disproportionate burden of rising energy costs on low-wealth communities. These societal barriers have hampered the opportunity for marginalized communities to lend their perspective to the shaping of their clean energy future and fully benefit from rapidly expanding clean energy markets. For instance, only 7% of solar workers in 2017 were African American, while the percentage of solar workers in the United States grew 168% since 2010, according to the Solar Foundation. Against the backdrop of global climate change, these disparities have driven equity and justice to the forefront of the energy transition conversation and made just energy a top priority. When utilized as a framework for mobilizing advocacy around energy equity issues, Just Energy represents an equity ecosystem of frontline communities, subject matter experts, houses of worship, youth movements, and academia, organizing together to ensure that the benefits of a clean energy economy include fair prices, freedom from negative health impacts, and access to thriving wage employment. We believe that this approach is central to the energy equity movement and that the future of our communities is dependent upon collective action towards an equitable, inclusive, just energy future for all. Thank you.
Our second panelist is, as I mentioned, Sarah Schrader. And Ms. Schrader is the owner and co-founder of Bonsai Design and the president of the Outdoor Recreation Coalition of the Grand Valley. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss rural economic change in Western Colorado today. I live in a town called Grand Junction on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains. Our community is 74% public lands and is named after the junction of two mighty rivers, the Gunnison and the Colorado, that flow through the center of our town. Our valley has been on the leading edge of change that is playing out in rural communities across the United States. Like many other rural communities in America, our area has had a volatile economic history driven largely by the fossil fuels industry: oil, gas, coal, shale, and uranium. Each wave of extraction has provided jobs and prosperity, only to be followed by the inevitable bust when commodity prices fall or policies change. This boom and bust cycle of extraction takes a toll on the economy and the psyche of our community. It creates a sense of hopelessness that persists even into new boom cycles because we're trained to believe that economic prosperity is fleeting and temporary. The results over time have been devastating. Our county's median household income is $13,000 below the state average. 56% of jobs where I live pay less than $17.50 an hour. A full 22% of children live in poverty compared to 15% in the state. An extraction-based economy also inadvertently diminishes the importance of a college education. The number of kids graduating high school who obtain any kind of post-secondary education is 20% below the national average. At a time when companies chase skilled and educated workforce, we are at a significant competitive disadvantage. Yet the economic reliance on extraction industries has been changing in Grand Junction in the past few years. A new trend is emerging as our community shifts towards diversified employment, an outdoor-centric identity, a growing university, and an economy that has the potential to break this insidious cycle of poverty. In 2004, my family relocated to Grand Junction, and shortly after, we started our company, Bonsai Design, out of our basement, deploying a small crew to build aerial adventures from zip lines to challenge courses, aerial playgrounds, and canopy tours all over North America. Now we are a turnkey operation with over 50 employees that provides everything from concept design to engineering, installation, training, inspections, and maintenance, and we even manufacture our own components. Like many other outdoor rec manufacturers in our community, we are proud to work with local fabricators, machinists, and employees that have historically worked for the oil and gas industry. Our employees and subcontractors have grit, tenacity, and a strong work ethic, and they love creating outdoor adventure experiences for people to enjoy for years to come. Bonsai also works in similar communities which, like ours, have been long dependent on extraction and are now diversifying. Our clients are, for example, the Boy Scouts of America Jamboree site in Mount Hope, West Virginia, where we built 26 bonsai courses between 2011 and 2013. Our company is currently working with several municipalities, including the city of Rockland, California, in an old quarry, and the city of Farmington, New Mexico, as well as Pipestem State Park in West Virginia, These communities are rebranding themselves as outdoor adventure hubs. The outdoor recreation industry is a powerhouse economic force in America at almost 3% of the GDP. In Colorado, it's a $62.5 billion industry employing over 500,000 Coloradans. In our community alone, the outdoor rec industry contributes over $300 million annually and thousands of jobs. And rural communities all over the country are realizing the important role that the outdoor recreation industry could play in helping their economies thrive. In addition to providing jobs, the outdoor recreation industry in Grand Junction is leading efforts to redevelop and reignite our riverfront on the Colorado River. Long neglected, the riverfront was populated with junkyards, old tires and appliances, and an old uranium mill. We are turning a barren stretch of land into a business park surrounded by green space, a river recreation area, and an amphitheater with miles of trails around. A place where businesses can thrive and residents and visitors can enjoy the outdoors right in the heart of town. The irony in community like ours is that we have focused below the surface of the land to find economic prosperity. Yet the absolute best part of Western Colorado is the access to public lands and wild spaces for recreation on the surface. In our community, you can hunt, fish, paddle the rivers, mountain bike, ski, rock climb, and hike within minutes of your front door. Our community is now looking at outdoor recreation, a sustainable use of our lands to drive the economy. The outdoor recreation industry brings pride and opportunities back to a community that has struggled for decades. Essential to this transition is that we protect our public lands and act swiftly to combat climate change, as the economy in these areas depends on it. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Gosar, members of the committee, my name is Dr. Bill Bissett. I'm the President and CEO of the Huntington Regional Chamber of Commerce. Please know that my chamber represents more than 550 businesses and more than 30,000 employees in our region. It is also important to remember that West Virginia is the only state completely contained within Appalachia, and as an Appalachian, we like to think that where I'm from is a gateway to the wonderful place that we call Appalachia. Economically, I bring you good news today from West Virginia. Since my return home to my home state more than 2 years ago, we have gone from catastrophic job losses and declining state revenues to job growth in a state that is now stable and growing financially. Much of this previous economic downturn related to a severe decrease in the production of fossil fuels, but we are now witnessing a rebirth in both coal and natural gas production. With coal, we continue to be concerned with our nation's inability to build new coal-fired power plants. Until this fact changes, the domestic market for steam coal, coal used to create electricity, will continue to decrease as coal plants are retired. However, the story is not often told that in the southern coal fields of West Virginia, the economy is doing well due to metallurgical coal, or coal that makes steel, which is also known as met coal. This coal, which sells at a higher price and burns much hotter, is in great demand both in the United States and around the world. As we Americans discuss not only new infrastructure, but also the maintenance of roads, bridges, and other large structures, large amounts of steel will be needed, and I would hope that that steel will be made in the United States. And to make that steel, I would want us to use met coal from West Virginia. To the north in West Virginia, we see an expansion of natural gas production and tremendous investments in our state's future. From new wells to new pipelines, the jobs, revenue, and additional economic development related to this production of natural gas has spiked optimism and opportunity in our state. While I bring you good news economically from West Virginia, it comes with a caveat. As I talk to business leaders and job providers back home, many of them are thrilled to see this uptick, but they also find it fragile. In West Virginia, in the heart of Appalachia, we worry that as a global issue like climate change is addressed, we worry that it will damage our economy in West Virginia far greater than any other state. My chamber is located outside the coal fields in West Virginia, but we are all too familiar with a downturn in coal production does to our region. At a time when our country and the world needs steel and electricity, met and steam coal production provides high-paying jobs, not just for coal miners, but engineers, lawyers, accountants, machinery workers, and numerous other service jobs that are dependent on the mining of coal for their existence. While we have witnessed the last downturn, we worry that actions here in Washington will damage West Virginia's rebounding economy, job growth, and long-term economic development. I believe, and would suggest that many of my fellow West Virginians believe, that we can produce coal and natural gas while also creating new economic opportunities for our citizens. We simply do not have to sacrifice one industry to create new opportunities. Some final thoughts. As a person fascinated with how we electrify this country every day in a reliable and low-cost way, I would suggest to you that what works for one state might not work well for other states. What works for Arizona and its economy probably doesn't work well for West Virginia. We are very different places. When the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, we still need to power our homes and businesses, and fossil fuels, especially through combined cycle plants using both coal and natural gas, can provide this critical backbone of electricity production. In my opinion, we need all forms of energy production. To make windmills and solar panels, you're going to need a lot of materials that come from underground, and that involves extraction of minerals and the use of land. As a senior engineer told me early in my career, every form of energy production has an economic and environmental cost to it. I think everyone in this room and on this panel would agree that no one wants to create poverty and hopelessness by their actions. As many of us Appalachians try to tell our stories beyond our borders, we worry that the future of our region and how impediments to our ability to produce natural resources will return us to what was a very dark period in my home state and in Appalachia. As climate change is a global issue, we must consider its impact in a global way and with a global solution. Sacrificing the economic future of West Virginia and Appalachia will have little impact on global man-made carbon, but you will succeed in creating more poverty, more hopelessness, and an uncertain future for those of us lucky enough to call West Virginia home. Thank you again for allowing me to share my thoughts with you today. It's been an honor.
Now recognizes Mr. Hilly.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee, my name is Peter Hilly. I'm the president of MACID, and I'm glad to be talking with you today about a just transition to a new economy for coal-impacted communities. This is a map of Appalachia showing the economically distressed counties in red. They fall into the bottom 10% of all the counties in the nation, and this map has remained largely unchanged for decades. The long history of coal mining in Appalachia did not create prosperous communities because in the early days, these were not jobs that paid well. You load 16 tons and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. That's why Lyndon Johnson declared war on poverty from a front porch in eastern Kentucky. By the end of World War II, we had 75,000 coal mining jobs in Kentucky, but in the 1950s, the jobs began to be mechanized. Over the next several decades, coal production went up and down, and mostly up, but as the jobs became more technical, they paid better. But with bigger machines, more coal could be produced with fewer workers. On this chart, the upper line shows production, the lower line shows jobs declining. Then in 2012, something unprecedented happened. For the first time, natural gas per BTU became cheaper than coal. When these lines crossed, the coal industry collapsed. Suddenly, we lost 10,000 jobs, half the remaining jobs in mining in our state. This has been a very real tragedy for the miners, their families, their communities, and all the other businesses that relied on those earnings. But this is a tragedy that sits on top of a disaster. The disaster is the fact that even before we lost those 10,000 jobs, this region had been economically distressed for generations. So the question is not how do we replace those 10,000 mining jobs and get back to where we were. The question is how do we go forward? How do we build a new economy for Appalachia, an economy that's more diverse, resilient, sustainable, and equitable, because the old economy was none of those things. We call this just transition, and the justice we call for in this transition is based on the reality that these communities and communities like ours literally fueled the growth of this great nation. And they sacrificed lives, families, health, water, prosperity, even as they gave us the timber that built our towns, the coal that fired our industries, and the steel that made our cars. They are owed a debt, and we can repay that debt with the new investments that are needed to grow the new economy. We must reinvest in our communities, many of which have lost more than half of their population to outmigration. We must make them places where the young people growing up there want to stay, where those who went off to college or their first job want to come back, where people who left to find work and had successful careers somewhere else might come back to retire, and where the tourist who comes to visit decides they'd like to stay. All of the amenities and resources needed to revitalize these communities are themselves economic drivers, creating jobs and livelihoods. The local food restaurant, the coffee shop, the farmer's market, the craft brewery, housing, healthcare, and the quality of life that many people are looking for today. So we envision an economic transition driven by entrepreneurs whose businesses create goods and services to drive diverse local economies and focus on sectors that not only generate economic activity, but also generate benefits for the community. For example, at the nexus of food and energy, Gwen Christian owns a grocery store at a rural crossroads in Letcher County, Kentucky. She invested $500,000 in energy efficiency and now saves $40,000 a year in utility costs. The store looks so much better that her sales are up 7%, and she's hired 2 more full-time workers. Here is Scott Shoup. Scott is a 4th-generation coal miner, but after 22 years in the mines, he's now participating in our New Energy Interns program, which is funded by an ARC Power grant. Scott is learning to do energy audits and retrofits and plans to start his own energy efficiency business. This is Tim Robinson. He started a drug treatment program that now has facilities across eastern Kentucky. We financed one of those centers and also implemented energy efficiency measures that resulted in enough savings for them to buy a new van. There are many more examples to share, but the important thing is this: there is hope in these communities, and there are people who are digging in hard to create a brighter future. Investments like the Appalachian Regional Commission's Power Grants, the AML Pilot Program, and the proposed Reclaim Act represent important investments that can support these grassroots efforts. And as we build this new economy, we need to ensure that it creates a future with opportunities for all, meeting diversity with equity, and that we attend to the sustainability that is needed for our children and our grandchildren to thrive and for our planet to survive. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Dennison to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, committee members. Investing in the economic revitalization of the communities that have been extraction-based, that have sacrificed the most to fuel this country, must be front and center in the shaping of policy addressing climate change. Doing so cannot be an afterthought. As I think about this issue, I think about Wilburn. Wilburn is an on-the-job trainee with Coalfield Development. He was a miner for 17 years in Mingo County, West Virginia. And like so many other miners, in 2015, he was laid off when his mine shut down. He had to go on public assistance, something he would tell you he hated to do, but had to do to feed his family. Coalfield Development was able to put Wilburn back to work through a sustainable agriculture business that we incubated. This business converted a former mountaintop removal mine site into a sustainable farm where we sell fresh food products throughout the region. Wilburn and his fellow crew members work by what we call our 33, 6, and 3 model. 33 hours a week of paid work, just like you would for any other business, but 6 hours a week of higher education classroom time working towards an associate's degree, and 3 hours a week of personal life skill development. At the end of their 2.5-year contract, crew members transition from being unemployed and in need of public assistance to being trained workers with an associate's degree. We've started new businesses in bio-based manufacturing, solar, construction, arts and culture, and retail sectors. We have helped start over 50 new businesses and retrained over 800 formerly unemployed people. The farm where Wilburn works sits next to an active mountaintop removal site. And one morning, without trying to be profound, Wilburn was feeding the hens and the hogs. And you could see the active mountaintop removal happening just a couple acres away. And this is a process of huge equipment the size of a building, moving just massive amounts of earth, what's called overburden. And the overburden tumbles down these steep ledges and massive dust clouds go up. And Wilburn looked up and watched this happening, and he said, well, I reckon that there's the past, and this here's the future. The coal industry will never again be the dominant industry it once was, and this fact creates deep pain for those of us living in Appalachia, especially our miners. The transition away from coal, which is already underway, by the way, isn't just creating an economic crisis. It's a social crisis directly related to the opioid epidemic, and it's an environmental crisis leaving massive scars on our landscape that have to be dealt with. But the fact that coal isn't coming back doesn't mean that Appalachia has no future. The void left by coal's collapse is actually making room for new entrepreneurial spurts to grow up. And Appalachia can be a vital contributor in the fight against climate change. And Appalachia is no more guilty of contributing to climate change than most people in this country who have had to flip on their lights at night. With smart federal policy and investment, our country can accelerate these new sprouts of entrepreneurship. We need a national just transition task force to give focus. We need to create a national program to support coal communities in transition. The POWER program was a great start. We can grow from there. And we need to pass federal legislation, exactly what Peter mentioned, that improves conditions for former coal workers and distressed Appalachian communities, especially relating to the black lung crisis. If we don't pay attention to the economic hurt of extraction communities and invest in solutions that show there's a viable path forward, we'll only deepen the division in our country. We in Appalachia need to know we are valued, and the country needs to know we have more to offer than just coal. Too often when discussing economic transitions, policymakers announce, well, we can just retrain those people. And I do need to say that that is always way easier said than done. There are thousands of laid-off miners who have participated in federal training programs. They got a new certificate, but it doesn't matter because there aren't businesses left to take that certificate and get employed in. So at Coalfield Development, we've had to be much more holistic. We have to create new businesses at the same time as training new employees to staff those businesses and have a modern workforce. We need maximum flexibility at the ground level to pull this off. Wilburn is one of thousands of miners whose life was rocked by the shutdown of his mine. But at age 45, he's about to become a college graduate. He's helped us start an entire new business that sells food products throughout the region. Wilburn has transformed a moment of crisis into a transformational opportunity for himself and his family. With your support, an entire region can do the same.
Thank you. And now the chair recognizes Dr. Mason to testify.
Morning. Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, Ranking Member Gosar, and members of the committee for holding this hearing to discuss this very crucial transition. The Green New Deal resolution seeks, among other things, to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions through a fair and just transition for all communities and workers, while ensuring clean air and water, a sustainable environment, and justice and equity. While laudable, those objectives conflict in dimensions that just can't be reconciled. In recent years, wind turbine and transmission line sites located far from population centers have largely been developed. Further development will require working with communities and citizens to ensure a fair and just balance of access and resource generation closer to cities and homes. Such a process takes time, and jobs will not be created until that process comes to a conclusion. A fair and just process will take many years. There will be jobs dealing with batteries and generation technology, but those will be environmentally dirty in different ways. Rechargeable batteries, including lead acid, nickel metal hydride, nickel cadmium, and lithium-ion batteries, all contain toxic materials that are hazardous to human health and in the environment if disposed of inappropriately. Wind turbines use considerable amounts of rare earth elements to build permanent magnets and electric generators. Solar photovoltaic installations use similar ingredients. All of those are either valuable in short supply or both. Rather than mining those from conflict areas of the world like the Democratic Republic of Congo, they can be obtained through recycling. But jobs and industries related to that recycling will require handling concentrated quantities of heavy metals and other carcinogenic and mutagenic materials, risking human lives as well as soil and groundwater contamination. Without occupational safety rules, we risk exposing workers in those new jobs to both new and known safety hazards, like we did when exposing miners to black lung disease, construction workers to asbestos exposure, and workers and residents of nearby neighborhoods to birth defects and cancer arising from chemical and heavy metals. Residential solar contracts already involve terms similar to those that caused the recent real estate bubble, bust, and recession. Without consumer protection from rampant development, mandating green energy without protecting consumers violates the notion of a just and fair transition. While the green bond sector is booming, there's no assurance that the investments funded in the sector are really green in any meaningful sense. Bonds and funds selling on the popularity of the green moniker usually underperform their benchmarks and charge high investor fees. Like the tech bubble glamour stocks in the 1990s, a green investment bubble could arise that, when popped, could devastate the sector and forestall needed development, hurting both jobs and the environment. If the proposed mandate of carbon neutrality cannot be met with production cuts, then achieving that goal will have to rely upon offsets. But offsets aren't locally green and sometimes arise from poor policymaking and fraud. It's not clear that the U.S. should accept other countries' offsets, but there's currently no mechanism by which to accept or reject their fiat permits. Diplomacy will be necessary to establish eligibility requirements, and that will take time. The proposed mandate will alter international patterns of trade and strategic resources and disrupt global supply chains. As markets adapt to the new patterns of energy resource trade, market failures will occur. Because energy affects every consumer and business in the nation, such failures may be even more disruptive than the recent credit crisis. Even without market failures, the mandate will impose widely varying effects upon states and their citizens, as some states pay more of the price for the adjustment than others. Because those costs are a complex function of existing fossil fuel use as well as energy imports from other states, the sponsors of this resolution cannot today say which states will suffer worse losses and which others will not. And they cannot therefore guarantee the social or distributional justice that they claim, or even the basis by which such justice will be meted out. The New Deal created jobs in an economy with more than 20% unemployment. We don't have 20% unemployment. According to Federal Reserve Vice Chairman Jerome Powell, unemployment is low and prices are near 2% inflation. We're in a good place. The proposed resolution is not a New Deal, nor do we necessarily need a New Deal. A better historical roadmap might be the National Monetary Commission. Following the financial panic of 1907, Congress convened the commission to study in depth best central banking practices around the world in order to make recommendations for meaningful reform. The result of that investigation, the Federal Reserve System, still stands as a major innovation that's one of the leading central banks in the world in terms of both effectiveness and stability. Our environment deserves the same thought and consideration. In closing, I'd like to note I was first included in the congressional greenhouse gas debate almost 10 years ago now. I agree that the issue is more important 10 years on, absolutely. I applaud Chairman Lowenthal's remarks about the need to begin a meaningful discussion here to lead this process forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the panel for their testimony. I remind the members of the committee, we have, as a committee rule, we impose 5 minutes limit on questions. I'm going to now begin to recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask. I'm going to defer my questions and begin with Congressman Levin for the first set of questions.
Well, thank you, Chair Lowenthal. I appreciate you holding today's hearing, and I'm pleased that our committee continues to discuss the broad impacts of climate change. This month, so far, we've held hearings highlighting both the incredibly important science that underpins our understanding of climate change, as well as the way our communities have been directly affected by the changing climate. Dealing with climate change in a bold and aggressive way is no fairy tale. Doing nothing and expecting this problem to take care of itself is the real fairy tale. Our discussions have clarified the urgent need to accelerate the country's clean energy production in order to reduce greenhouse gas-intensive fossil fuel use. I would also add that the carbon footprint of renewables is negligible when compared to fossil fuels. As an example, the carbon emissions per unit of PV electricity is 1/10 or less of even the most efficient natural gas power plant. A change to renewables is absolutely essential. However, we must account for the way that this change will affect communities across the nation and ensure a just transition. Clean energy production is an incredible economic opportunity that should be shared by all, especially those that have been dependent on fossil fuel production. Further, we need to account for communities of color, rural communities, and others who haven't historically been afforded equal economic opportunities. In California, our economy has grown because of the clean energy revolution. I look forward to working with my colleagues and friends on this committee to ensure as many communities as possible can share these benefits. And with that, I do have a couple questions for Mr. Dennison and Mr. Hilly, and I'd be interested to get both of your perspective on this. Mr. Dennison and Mr. Hilly, in his written testimony, Dr. Mason says, and I quote, "Even assuming enough new jobs are created to make up for the old jobs, Should we as a society just write off coal miners or oil and gas workers as a, quote, lost generation?
No. The solar industry already employs more than the oil industry and the coal industry combined in our country. That's a key point. At Coalfield Development, we incubated the first solar installation company in southern West Virginia. Our first crew chief was a former underground miner whose skills parlayed actually quite well. He was already a licensed electrician because of the nature of the equipment that he worked in. It only took 2 months to get him trained up, and the work ethic is phenomenal. Work ethic is not our problem, and because we can be adaptive and creative, and we have that gumption and grit, I don't think the current workforce has to be obsolete, no.
I would add that because of the technical nature of these jobs, as Brandon said, there's a very fast adoption curve. There's also a lot of work, in addition to work in renewables, in energy efficiency, and that can also be picked up very quickly. The former miners that we've been working with in our New Energy Interns program go through 6 months of training, at the end of which they are certified by the Business Professionals Institute, BPI certified, in order to do this same work. Some of them have been placed with housing organizations, working on some of the deficient housing stock that we have in Appalachia. And also, some of them are interested in starting their own new businesses, which, as you know, is the path to prosperity and the great American dream. I'll just mention, too, that this is an investment that pays for itself. When you do energy efficiency, particularly commercial energy efficiency, that can pay for itself very quickly because commercial energy meters charge both a demand rate and a usage rate. And when you implement efficiency measures, you reduce both of those. Often the demand rate is half of a commercial energy bill. As an example, we helped a grocery warehouse in London, Kentucky do a lighting retrofit. It was a $200,000 investment. They're saving $100,000 a year on their utility costs. So it paid for itself in 2 years, and they're now seeing that as a direct add to their bottom line. A lot of this new investment can pay for itself.
Well, Mr. Hilly, Mr. Dennison, I thank you both very much for your work to accelerate our transition to a sustainable economy and for your work on a just transition. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield my time.
Thank you, and I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Gosar, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to enter into the record actually 2 articles from the Financial Times. Ironically, today, China's demand for electric vehicles charges copper. That's always great for my state because we're known as the copper state, one of the 5 Cs. And Australia hopes to cash in on new cobalt rush. I'd like to have those entered in the record. By the way, for everybody that's wondering why I have this up there, anybody want to gather what that is? That's a nodule of rare earths that comes from the Mojave Desert in my district. It's particularly high in niobium, by the way, okay? Mr. Dennison, you made some comments that we need to correct their record. You said that there were by far more solar jobs in the country. That's not correct. The oil and gas natural industry supports 10.3 million U.S. jobs and nearly 8% of the U.S. economy. As of 2017, 250,271 American workers worked in the solar industry. This is 9,000 jobs fewer than in 2016. AWEA has, or this is the wind area, has 105,000. So be careful with the facts. Oh, by the way, this is from the Solar Foundation. So these are facts from yours. So, and I'm really glad that you brought up the overburden area because it's very pertinent to these things, these rare earths, because overburden has been found to have lots of rare earths that are attainable here. So, I mean, repurposing miners for the new advent of that mining industry is very, very important to me, particularly when we're so dependent upon these. Dr. Mason, you mentioned in your testimony that renewable technologies such as wind farms and solar panels require various critical minerals and rare earth elements to function. The Green New Deal calls for the United States to run exclusively on clean and renewable energy in 10 years. Can you remark how the global market for critical minerals may respond to a surge in demand of this magnitude? And also talk to me about who controls the marketplace for these rare earths.
Well, the article in the Financial Times this morning was very, very interesting in that regard. It named 0 American companies involved in the Democratic Republic of Congo. If you're familiar with the results of their elections that were kind of muscled through last week, you'll know they're not democratic at all. It also focused on the artisanal mining, people just digging in the ground to get this valuable cobalt to sell it to make more money than they can make from anywhere else. You can call that small business if you want and entrepreneurial, but it's tremendously dirty. There are no safety regulations, and we have children working in these artisanal mines just as we had in West Virginia many, many years ago and tried to regulate out in the U.S. and did so relatively successfully with safety regulations. These minerals are extremely valuable. They're in demand throughout the world. China is beating us to the rush, as are European mining conglomerates operating in these countries with virtually no safety regulations or environmental protections. And those need to be calculated in to the overall environmental footprint, not just carbon footprint of these technologies. And I'd also like to note, even with regard to the carbon footprint of solar, that doesn't factor in what's called rejected energy. As long as we keep wasting energy and having it go out in the form of unused heat, which is where 66% of energy goes, according to Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, we're going to be in the same problem for a long time.
Well, in fact, you bring it up that we're going to be 100% dictated. I mean, China has this policy, One Belt, One Road, and they're actually extorting much of the discipline and oversight and control of these rare critical minerals. You know, you bring up the causticness of particularly smelting these rare earths. They're bound, so current technology uses high concentrations of sulfuric acid, in which China is very lackadaisical. The United States is much more disciplined within it. In fact, a good friend of mine right now is experimenting with high concentrations of citric acid in order to extract these. So, I mean, we do these better than anybody else in the world, and if new technology is so predicated upon it, we ought to be investing in this. And, you know, overburden is one of those areas, if I'm not mistaken. Am I not correct, Dr. Mason?
Yes, absolutely. All energy is dirty. We need to conserve energy.
Well, and I'm running out of time, but, you know, I've always been one of those that believes in all the above. In fact, my good friend actually has a power company in North Scottsdale that runs on solar during the day and gas at night, utilizing that base load principle. Not all energy is the same. You have to be able to have a continual output wattage along those lines to make sure that everybody gets, when they flip the switch, they can actually have power. And with that, I'll yield back and wait for a second round.
Thank you, Mr. Gosar. Before I recognize Mr. Brown, I'd like to say my staff has just supplied me, if, you know, at the risk of just taking it to another level in this discussion between Mr. Dennison and Representative Dennison and Mr. Gosar in terms of exactly the jobs that are impacted. If we're in my understanding, if we're talking about direct jobs, that is, jobs where people are hired by the oil and gas industry, versus direct jobs in solar, there are approximately 150,000 at this moment direct jobs where people are hired by the industry in oil and gas, and 50,000 direct jobs where they're hired by the industry in coal, which is still less than the 242,000 which are directly hired by solar at this moment. But there is a discussion in terms of, and I think it's a reasonable one, in terms of the impacts and overarching. But those are the direct jobs.
If the gentleman would yield.
Certainly.
A lot of those jobs are for the construction of solar fields, and so they're temporary. They are not long-lasting.
I appreciate that, but it's important that we kind of clarify and we realize how complex these issues really are. Representative Brown, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the spirit of Representative Bishop, who's not here today, I'm not going to read my statement. Yes, indeed, although I may make reference to it, or refer to it, I should say. So, look, for the record, this hearing is not about the Green New Deal. This hearing is about what are some of the things we need to do to account for, make adjustments, as the energy sector continues a kind of conversion or transition to renewable energy sources. And whether we're on the same pace that we're on, or whether we, through legislation and policy changes, accelerate that pace, it is important for us to ask and answer the questions: what does it mean for the labor force? What does it mean for poor and communities of color? And how does everyone benefit from this conversion, regardless of the rate in which it occurs? So my question, which I think almost anyone can speak to, but Mr. Dennison, I certainly would like to hear your thoughts. Ms. Farley, yours, and Ms. Schrader, yours. What are some specific, and Mr. Dennison, you mentioned the 33-6-3 model. What are some specific federal authorizations or appropriations, whether in higher education, workforce development, or federal procurement, that can assist the development of that workforce as we convert from, carbon-based to renewable energy sources, or that assist the creation of businesses that might replace a coal industry in a particular community? What are some of the specific federal authorizations and appropriations that we might consider? Thank you.
Be happy to answer that. I do want, for the record, I'm quoting a Forbes article on January 25th, 2017, with my figures. Now, it is specific to electricity generation, specific to that process, but also a lot of pipeline jobs, a lot of gas jobs
Dennison,
are in pipeline
Mr. Dennison,
development.
are you responding to?
Yes, sir.
Not on my time, please.
The 33, 6, and 3, the Appalachian Regional Commission has been indispensable. It's an example of a place-based federal policy that I think is really important to this transition, rather than broad, policies that treat every region the same. I'll also say the Reclaim Act is a really important piece of legislation for our region. So is the reauthorization of the Abandoned Mine Lands Program in the first place. Something that happened a few years back was the AML pilot program for mine lands, which allowed for much more local flexibility to be innovative and to help start some new businesses. I think that level of flexibility really is critical.
We've talked a lot about energy efficiency today, and just like reduce, reuse, and recycle, that first R is reduce. I think when we have conversations about the energy transition, we must remember the importance of energy efficiency and the role energy efficiency plays in reducing our demand and consumption for energy first. And there are many opportunities on the national, state, and local level to support energy policies specifically focused on increasing energy efficiency programs, as well as weatherization assistance programs that have often suffered from reduced federal funding. These programs are specifically tied to increased job opportunities in the energy efficiency sector, as we've heard a couple of times today from Mr. Dennison and Mr. Hilly. Energy efficiency can reduce high energy burdens on working families, which in turn supports community wealth building. Energy efficiency improves economic stability by increasing entrepreneurship and thriving wage job opportunities. Energy efficiency also increases health by reducing harmful carbon emissions that pollute our air. And also, again, energy efficiency promotes economic development and community wealth building.
Thank you, Ms. Farley. I'm sorry for interrupting, but I do want to hear from Ms. Schrader.
Sure.
These 5 minutes go real fast.
Yeah. Sure thing.
The outdoor recreation economy is really important in this piece, because I think a lot of rural communities can transition to this outdoor recreation economy and then build a diversified economy with manufacturing companies and tech companies and healthcare right in their communities in these rural places. And so one of the things that's really important to us is to take a lead on protecting public lands. So the reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, protecting the public lands package, and also the CORE Act that was just introduced by Congressman Neguse and Senator Bennett is really important in making sure that we have a diversified economy that is going to be a great place for families to thrive.
Thank you. And our next Mr. Westerland?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. You know, as we, I know the gentleman said this isn't about the Green New Deal, but obviously everything about energy would play into this idea of a Green New Deal. So I've been trying to look at the scope of what we're talking about. If we truly are trying to replace all fossil fuels in 10 years, and if we're looking at world energy production or world energy use, the data that I've found shows, this was 2006 data, so it's a little bit old, that the world used 471 quads of energy. A quad is one with 15 zeros after a quadrillion BTUs of energy, and the world uses projected in 2020 to use 500 quads of energy. Of those 471 quads, 408 of it were produced from fossil fuels, and only 63 quads of the energy consumed in the world came from renewables. So that's if you look globally, that's quite a challenge to replace 408 quads, actually more than that now, of fossil fuels in a 10-year time frame. But if we look at it just here in the U.S., in 2017, the U.S. used 98 quads of energy. And of that, 77% of it, or 76 quads, came from fossil fuels. Then that broke down. The highest rate was from natural gas, about 32%, petroleum about 28%, and coal about 18%. So here in the U.S., we still only have about a little over 20% of our energy comes from renewables, and that includes nuclear. And I know a lot of people don't like to include nuclear in it. So if you take the nuclear out, it's only less than 13% of all of our energy comes from renewables right now. So we're talking about a huge transition to go from to 100% renewables, no fossil fuels, in 10 years, and especially if we don't like nuclear, which is a very clean form of energy as well. But I was interested in what Mr. Dennison said about the number of jobs in solar versus coal and petroleum. He contends that there are more jobs in solar now than coal and petroleum combined, which creates a bit of a conundrum because we're trying to figure out what to do with displaced coal workers. And since solar is only a tiny fraction of the renewables that are out there now, yet there's more people in that field than in coal and petroleum combined, it seems like there would be a huge demand and jobs available for these displaced coal workers if you just train them to be in the solar field. So can any of our panelists tell me why there's not a huge demand for workers in the solar field, and why we're having to come up with tourism and other forms of employment to help these displaced workers?
There is demand. We just certified 20 of them last year. And although renewables still make up a small piece of the pie, renewables have been the fastest growing piece of the pie. So there's lots of innovation and investment in renewables.
Dr. Mason, can you address, from an economic standpoint, the manpower per million BTUs it takes to do renewable energy versus fossil fuel energy, and would there be a lot more workers required in the renewable fields?
Now you're getting at the math that makes more sense. From an economic perspective, it's not just the number of jobs, it's the value of those jobs, whether denominated in dollars or denominated in energy production, as you just did with your mathematics. The examples quoted here, one required 6 months of additional training. It's wonderful that that is provided. I come originally from Gary, Indiana, and have faced a severe transition in that region of the country through the 80s and 90s. Retraining is absolutely crucial. We can overcome some of these humps, but currently none of the legislation plans for that. We have programs in place in small places of the country. We do need to expand those to make this a meaningful transition.
So if it takes more workers per unit of output, won't that drive the price extremely high?
Well, either the price has to be high or the payment to workers has to be low. But we're not neutral with respect to price.
Out of time.
Yes, Representative Case, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the courtesy of letting me join you today. Dr. Bissett, did I say that right? Okay, thank you. My questions to you have two big assumptions built into them that I'm asking you to get beyond for a little bit. Number one, climate change is real. Number two, energy transition is inescapable. It's just when and how we do it. That's my working assumption. So you may not agree with what I just put forward, but I want to focus on if I am correct, and if Congress, as a result, a majority of Congress enacts policies that are purposely designed to move us to renewable energy at the expense of coal, and if there is therefore a tremendous consequence to the businesses and communities that you represent, how do we best transition those communities? That's my critical question. I'm not asking you whether we have to transition or not. I'm just asking you for now, how do we do it? How do we best do it? And as a prelude, just tell me a little bit more about your chamber. You've got 550 businesses. How many of those businesses are directly or indirectly dependent on coal?
When I took the job, Congressman, I didn't think many were, and I quickly learned I was wrong. Again, my chamber's outside of the coal fields, and a great many are. And again, the lawyers, engineers, accountants, like I talked about, a land holding company, barges, all those things, kind of not the coal mining jobs, but the indirect jobs. As to your question, my big concern would be that you can't just look at those direct jobs, that direct impact. You've got to look beyond that.
Okay.
Because when the downturn occurred, Congressman, it really affected us there, and we don't really mine coal where my chamber's located.
I see. So has your chamber institutionally considered the best form of transition for a post-coal energy world? Have you actually undertaken the worst-case scenario discussion from your perspective of how do we best transition? Mr. Dennison, in his testimony, he had 3 bullets. His bullets were, number 1, create a national just transition task force. Number 2, create a national program to support coal communities to include the Power Act. Number 3, pass federal legislation to improve the conditions of former coal workers in distressed communities to include the Reclaim Act. Is that a good program from your perspective? Do you think that will get the job done? How do we plan for a transition in a way that will best assist the communities that will be negatively impacted if we don't get ahead of the transition now?
It's a great question. It will take time to do that. Coalfield Development is a dues-paying member of my chamber. We're actually, Brandon's a board member of my chamber, and we support a lot of his workforce development programs and recently adopted a resolution in support of it. We may disagree on the position we're in, and I'm not trying to move away from your assumptions, but Appalachia needs more educational attainment. Appalachia needs livelihoods, and that goes back to my concern. When we saw the downturn previously, we were wondering when it would stop. Seeing it return now, our concern again is that there's going to be votes made here that's going to put us back in that jeopardy. It's a very tenuous time, a fragile time, like I was talking about. But no, we're supportive of other economic development. I think we could do both, Congressman. I think we can mine coal. I think we'd have a new economy. I think we can do it all. Because that new economy will benefit from low-cost, reliable electricity generated by natural gas and coal.
I'm not sure I agree with your assumption over the long term. I think you're taking a bit of a short to mid-term view of it. I'm looking out 20 plus years. If you had the time to plan for some kind of a transition where coal would be not acceptable anymore in any major scale, how do we get ahead of that? That's really my question: is how do we together plan the best possible transition here? Have you, going back to one question, you haven't undertaken that scenario within the chamber or anything like that? Like, how do we actually move beyond this?
We haven't currently, because right now there's been this expansion, this growth, especially in southern coal fields. Northern coal fields have not been that way in West Virginia, but they've had the natural gas.
Has anybody in the coal industry done this transition thinking and planning in the coal communities? Has anybody actually come together for a larger picture How do we transition out of this if, in fact, we do have to have an energy transition away from fossil fuel
I'm sure as they look at,
dependent?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I apologize. I'm sure as they look at long-term investments, investments in their coal mines and wells, I'm sure there's a concern about that. But at the same time, the market is currently there, and they're feeding that market. If they don't feed it in the United States, they're going to feed it internationally.
No, I understand that. That's currently.
Yes, sir.
And I'm trying to think out into the future for the most orderly way of doing this, as opposed to having circumstances thrusted upon you, and which is not a very good time to do emergency transition planning.
Thank you.
And now we turn to Representative Graves for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing, and appreciate all of your testimony, and appreciate you being here today. Ms. Farley, I was looking, I represent South Louisiana, and I was looking at your testimony where you made mention that Birmingham, Atlanta, New Orleans, and Memphis hold the greatest, I'm quoting your testimony, hold the greatest energy burdens for low-income households. I pulled some data that we had used last week at a hearing showing that the different energy prices per kilowatt hour in the states. Alabama, for example, is 12.41 per kilowatt hour. Georgia's 12.26. Tennessee is 10.79. And Louisiana, coming in at the lowest cost in the nation, is 9.37. Whereas other states, we had the governor of Massachusetts here last week, who was here advocating for renewable policies. The state of Massachusetts is 21.11 cents per kilowatt hour, more than double that of Louisiana, nearly double that of the other states. Other states that are fun to pick on sometimes, Mr. Huffman and Mr. Lowenthal, just for fun, 19.9 cents per kilowatt hour. So I guess I'm trying to understand, it seems like lower prices would.
The gentleman yield for a correction
Can I get an answer first?
on California? Yeah, well, we can go back to that.
All right. Does that make sense? So it seems like lower prices would be helpful and versus the higher prices that other states have, and just wonder if you could respond to that. Mike?
Oh, thank you. Yes, absolutely. Rates alone do not equal bills. So when we are talking about energy burden, we are talking about the fully burdened cost of a bill to households and ratepayers. So yes, there are some states in the South that do boast lower rates, but that does not make a bill.
It doesn't.
There are many.
But so if we had Massachusetts rates more than double, do you think that would make it easier to afford?
I'm not familiar with the numbers of Massachusetts. Do applaud their efforts in their shift to renewable energy, and saw that testimony last week. But in the South, again, while many states and investor-owned utilities boast lower than average national rates, rates alone do not equal utility bills. There are many fees and sometimes punitive in regards to solar across many states in the South that do equal higher bills and ultimately higher burdens on lower income households.
Mr. Chairman, I'm asking, I was concerned to submit for the record the documents showing the various rates. I'm not sure that I understand how energy efficiency would be the burden of how actions of a state could prevent an individual from pursuing energy efficiency improvements in their own homes, but again.
That will be accepted
Thank you. Number two, Mr. Chairman, I ask while I'm doing UCs for fun, this is a document, May 2018, from the National Association of State Energy Officials showing that the jobs from coal, natural gas, oil as compared to solar aren't even kind of close. As a matter of fact, when you add them up quickly, it looks like you're about 3 times more jobs in those fields than in the solar market. Lastly, Dr. Mason.
Without objection.
Thank you. Dr. Mason, understand you've done work, Office of Comptroller of the Currency, Federal Reserve, European Union, and other impressive places, and of course, also a professor at LSU. So thank you very much for being here. I just want to quickly ask you to comment on the Green New Deal or other concepts where the United States unilaterally takes aggressive actions to reduce emissions. Just comparatively talking about the low kilowatt hour in Louisiana that largely is a natural gas fuel source for electricity generation. What happens globally when you squeeze the United States in terms of emissions? What happens globally when you do something like that?
Well, these are strategic resources recognized worldwide. And just socioeconomically, when you start redistributing strategic resources around the world, countries will fight for strategic resources. They will fight through negotiating processes, through international relations processes, and sometimes even physically fight for those resources. So when we start moving around the distribution of those resources, we really put the world at risk in a lot of different ways. I'm not saying that that should prevent us from doing so. I'm merely saying that we need to look at this problem in a holistic, multidimensional way to try to understand the multiple tentacles that reach out. I want to point out that the jobs issue, for instance, is really not just an energy jobs issue. It's relating to the hollowing out of the middle of America. And that hollowing out is occurring fundamentally through access to education, which isn't equally attainable in the middle of the country right now. We need to develop this country overall, and this is a much larger problem than energy, although it kind of starts with energy, because if we have efficient energy from a variety of sources, we can better develop. So these things are what we call an endogenous process. There are various feedback loops involved with them. It's very complex. There are sciences dealing with analyzing these. And I think, Chairman Lowenthal, please begin those discussions, respectful discussions, so that we can work out some of these feedback mechanisms and put in place meaningful policies to not just help coal fields, but expand some of these programs nationwide to the core of America, and think about how much that is going to take, where the money is going to come from, and let's get moving.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Huffman, Representative Huffman.
Well, thanks. And Mr. Graves, the witness gave part of my correction that I wanted to send your way, but we've got to look at energy bills and not just rates. That's super important when you look at a state like California that has invested tremendously in energy efficiency. Because of those investments, bills have come way down, even though if you look at the unit cost of energy and rates, it would appear to be higher. So I would really urge you to take a look at that, and then let's see where the states compare with each other.
Thank you, and we'll also take your moderate temperatures.
Right. We can do all kinds of interesting cultural exchanges. I want some of your gumbo. So I was interested in the discussion that I just caught involving Mr. Bissett. And Mr. Hilly, I noticed you shaking your head a little bit during some of the testimony regarding this coal renaissance that I would argue is kind of a temporary thing. The Trump administration has gone out of its way, engaged in Herculean efforts to breathe life into what I think most other objective observers would say is a dying industry, coal. One of the many indications of this huge effort across the aisle to prop up coal against all of the other forces that are causing it to be a declining industry involves this zombie coal earmark that Mr. McClintock and I even worked on in prior years. There was actually this earmark from the height of the Cold War that required U.S. military bases in Germany to buy a specific type of coal from Pennsylvania. And it was not efficient. It was absolutely corporate cronyism of the worst order. And Mr. McClintock and I worked together to eliminate that from the defense budget. It's back in this year. And once again, American military bases in Germany are buying Pennsylvania coal because Congress says they have to and the Trump administration says they have to. So there's an incredible effort to prop up coal for a little while longer. I would argue it's a little bit like these warm days in February we have here in Washington. The cherry blossoms will kind of start to come out, but it's not really spring. I want to hear your thoughts, Mr. Hilly, because you were shaking your head.
So I think what's important to understand about what's been a fairly small uptick in coal production is that it is largely in metallurgical coal, and I think Bill would agree with me on that. And it's important to understand metallurgical coal is geologically a different type of coal that doesn't exist everywhere. So there is some in southern West Virginia, there's some in Virginia, there's a very narrow band of it in far eastern Kentucky, but most of Kentucky's coal is thermal coal or steam coal, which is used to generate electricity, and that has simply not come back. We had a minor increase in 2017 of about 30 jobs in Kentucky, and then in 2018 we lost another 200. So the thermal coal's not coming back in Appalachia, and to the extent that it will continue to be a part of our energy mix, and it will for some time, it's not going to come from Appalachia because our coal is harder to get. It's more expensive to mine. The good accessible seams have been mined out, and it's not cost-effective to blow off the top of a mountain when you can go somewhere else and scoop it off the surface of the ground. So Appalachia is not going to be competitive, and that's why this work of creating a just transition for these communities is critical, and we have the means and the processes to do that.
And to not do that long-term transition planning just because there appears to still be a market right now, how would you characterize that?
I think short-sighted would be a good way to describe it. And in fact, there are a lot of significant efforts going on. Congressman Rogers and then Governor Beshear in Kentucky created the SOAR initiative, which has been a large planning process, recognizing that thermal coal wasn't going to come back, that Kentucky coal wasn't going to come back. We have the largest concentration of distressed counties in Appalachia, and there is broad recognition that we need to do this. And the plan that SOAR has put together is a broad plan, and it has a strong emphasis on entrepreneurship, as does the Appalachian Regional Commission.
All right, so while I've got you, I know you've been a huge supporter of solar deployment in Appalachia. Do you see a future for broader adoption of solar in the region, and can you describe some of the ways the federal government can help with solar deployment in the region?
Yeah, we're actually seeing an interesting uptick in demand for solar in small commercial enterprises. MESID is a CDFI. We're a small business lender. We work with our clients to do energy efficiency first because that's the low-hanging fruit. But many of them are now coming to us first saying, no, I want solar. We say, okay, but if you do the efficiency, you don't have to put as much solar on your roof. But they see it as part of marketing. They also see it as a way to respond to rising energy bills. I think there are probably a lot of things the federal government could do to support and encourage that.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you, and I now recognize Ms. Cheney for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter a document into the record that's titled Overview, and then frequently asked questions that initially appeared on Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's website and was submitted to NPR.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate very much the opportunity to discuss this issue today of how we transition our communities to a so-called green economy. My state of Wyoming, as I'm sure our witnesses know, is the nation's largest coal-producing state. And we also know in Wyoming that coal is going to continue to be a crucially important source of baseload power for the nation, that the reliability is something that simply cannot be replaced, and that it's a national security issue in addition to an economic issue. And so my constituents are obviously very concerned about this notion that we're somehow going to transition over the course of 10 years here to, an economy that is entirely run on green energy. And certainly they have concerns about the fossil fuel aspect of that. But I have to say one of the issues that people are particularly concerned about is the extent to which we're no longer going to have air travel, apparently, according to some of the frequently asked question answers we've seen. So I guess I'd like to start by asking each witness to tell me exactly how they arrived in Washington, D.C. for this hearing, and it's just a one-word answer, and I'll start with you, Ms. Farley.
A big white pickup truck.
I drove.
Plane.
Air and Metro.
Well, thank you very much. And so I'd like to ask, I would assume that each of the witnesses who believes that we should in fact move towards net zero emissions would say that we ought to do so gradually, not suddenly. And so I would ask, and I'll start with you, Ms. Farley, if you could describe for me perhaps exactly how we'll do that gradually. I would assume we're not just going to wait 10 years and then all of a sudden tell people they can't fly, but that we'll be in a situation where over the course of the 10 years, we would somehow gradually work our way out of air travel. And I would also have to guess that that would involve some sort of prioritization. So I assume even my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who support the Green New Deal, and perhaps the witnesses who support the Green New Deal, wouldn't advocate, for example, that we cancel things like, life flights. They wouldn't advocate that we immediately move away from being able to transport people who have, life-threatening illnesses by plane, but that there would be some other prioritization there. So, Ms. Farley, could you tell me exactly how the government should prioritize air travel and the gradual move away from all air travel?
I would depend on the FAA and other federal agencies that focus on air travel to tackle that question. The Green New Deal is a sweeping collection of recommendations and policies.
Thank you very much, Ms. Farley. So the FAA then, I would assume, I guess we're going to set up a situation where the FAA then can tell individual citizens which of their air travel is worthy and important and which isn't. And it would seem to me, I guess we would then have a situation where the FAA could say, for example, you know what, vacation travel, that's not essential. We got to make sure that we can do the air travel for the people that really need it, so no vacation travel. Would you say we're going to have some sort of a vacation commissar set up in the government to determine what kind of air travel makes sense and what kind doesn't? Ms. Schrader, maybe I'll go to you on that question.
With all due respect, I came here to talk about my community and how we have transitioned.
So you don't support the Green New Deal then?
Decimated by the.
So Ms. Schrader, thank you. You don't support the Green New Deal?
I'm not an expert on the Green New Deal.
Okay.
The
thank you
gentlelady
very
yields
much.
for a
Mr.
correction on how
Mr.
she's
Hill-
badly
No, I
mischaracterizing
won't
the
yield.
resolution
Mr.
on the
Huffman,
Green New
Mr.
Deal.
Huffman, you
This
had
is
plenty
fiction.
of time.
This
Mr.
entire
Huffman,
line of
I'd like to have
questioning
my
is fiction.
time restored, please, Mr. Chairman. So let me ask you then, are there any other witnesses on the panel who do support the Green New Deal? Nobody supports the Green New Deal on this panel? Interesting.
I
That's peaceful.
support many of the policies and recommendations in the Green New Deal.
I see.
Specifically, the support to make sure that any climate solution strategy is centered in equity.
Thank you very much, Ms. Farley. I appreciate that. Reclaiming my time, I would just say that I think it's going to be crucially important for us to recognize and understand when we outlaw plane travel, we outlaw gasoline, we outlaw cars, I think actually probably the entire U.S. military because of the Green New Deal, that we are able to explain to our constituents and to people all across this country what that really means. And even when it comes down to something like air travel, which the frequently asked questions say they want to eliminate within the next 10 years, that means that the government is going to be telling people where they can fly to and where they can't. And I would assume, I guess that means our colleagues from California are going to be riding their bicycles back home to their constituents. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Do you want to do another second round? Yeah, I'm going to go with mine. I'm going to yield the first 1 minute of my 5 minutes to Representative Huffman.
Thank you. It's not really enough time to fully fact-check what we just heard, which was an entire line of questioning based on absolute hooey. I am co-sponsor of the Green New Deal resolution, and you got to read the resolution, okay? Not take extrapolations from some unofficial FAQs that actually were taken off an individual Congress member's website, because they do not reflect what's actually in the resolution. But the notion that any of us who are supporting the actual resolution, which you need to read, that we want to ban all air travel, that's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. None of us want to do that. I was just listening as the gentlelady said that we want to outlaw cars and get rid of the military. And there comes a point where this type of questioning is so disingenuous and so completely disconnected from anything factual that there ought to be a mechanism to strike it from the record. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you, and I will resume the rest of my time. My first question is for Ms. Farley. I'm trying to understand, or for you to help us reconcile some differences. In your initial testimony, you talk about, and in the print, and I'll just read the first sentence, we know that with data-informed certainty that systematically disenfranchised, under-resourced communities and communities of color in the South bear a disproportionate burden of the negative impacts of climate change and carbon-based energy production. How do you reconcile that statement with a statement that we heard in last week's presentation, which you indicated you also listened, where This committee heard testimony from a witness who argued that the increased use of fossil fuels is the best way to address high energy costs in low-income African-American communities. This is completely at odds. Can you kind of help us reconcile that difference?
Yes, absolutely. I agree that is completely at odds. And similar to the rates versus bills question, I believe that it is imperative that we understand that costs of energy are not just about the energy costs. The disproportionate burdens that people in the South and communities of color bear when located within 30 miles of coal-fired power plants. Approximately 68% actually of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant, suffer from low property values, increased accounts of lung disease, asthma, and asthma-associated attacks. These asthma-associated attacks also impact the healthcare and education sectors as emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and missed school days from children lead to missed work and job insecurity for their parents. All of these things are increased due to the harmful, life-threatening emissions of fossil fuel-based energy production. So that is where I would say there is no reconciliation between the ability of fossil fuels to provide benefit to under-resourced communities or communities of color.
Thank you. Ms. Schrader, you know, you mentioned in your testimony, you spoke in your testimony how economies that are dependent upon commodities such as oil and gas and coal are highly vulnerable, repeated cycles of boom or bust, not the image that we hear today, but that's really been what the history has been. And then you offer to us another alternative, outdoor recreation, and others in terms of protection of public lands, how to use public lands. Does outdoor recreation have the similar boom or bust cycles, or can you talk to us about that? Because you're offering a different view of the economy year to year also. If you can explain that to us.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. We have not seen a boom-bust cycle in outdoor recreation because it is a industry that is so important and ingrained in the quality of life. So what we're seeing in a community like Grand Junction is that we are attracting manufacturing, aviation, tech businesses to relocate to our community because they want the quality of life and the investments we've made in outdoor recreation. And so it's sort of this broad scope. You know, the other thing that I heard at the beginning was that these outdoor recreation jobs are underpaid and we're just coffee shop workers. And I would tell you that my company pays 130% of the Mesa County average salary, and there are other outdoor recreation companies like this, like Lightner Poma, like Mountain Racing Products. I mean, product companies, manufacturers that do the same. And so we are not seeing that boom-bust cycle that is so decimating and devastating for a community in oil and gas. And this has been happening for 70 years in Mesa County. So it's really important to transition to this sustainable, diversified economy.
Thank you. Now I ask Representative Kevin Hearne from Oklahoma. You have 5 minutes to ask questions. And thank you,
Mr.
for
Chairman.
being so patient. And
This is great. Thank you all for your testimony today and your honesty that, you know, how you got here. It was good. You know, as an engineer and a business person, I strongly believe in data and budgets, and I wish we all did. You know, at some point in time, we have to pay for this. I'm also a member of the Budget Committee by request because I want to know where all the money goes. And, you know, currently, we're at $22 trillion in debt, and it's forecast the next 10 years, if we don't do anything, we're going to be at $35 trillion. And you as small business people ought to appreciate the fact that I'm concerned about our national debt, which I think is a travesty. We don't have to have much science to look at that. Bloomberg, and since we're talking about New Green Deal, and Bloomberg estimates it's going to cost roughly $1 trillion a year over the next 10 years for the implementation of the New Green Deal. But, you know, I'm a person, as you all are, that believes in business that nothing operates in a silo into itself. So whatever you do affects other things. It affects our ability to take monies and help other issues, whether it's our needy or poor. And so we have a real opportunity here to try to figure out how we're going to pay for this. You know, one of the things that's interesting, I also talked to the OMB director the other day. We had a hearing and asked him how much it costs to pay for this. It would be almost doubling of the income tax on every individual in America to pay for the initiatives that my friends across the aisle want to implement. The other thing is when I don't look at static numbers, and I'm sure you don't either. You look at trends, and when you look at the trends, the population is growing in this country, the GDP is growing, and our emissions per GDP and per population or per capita are declining, which is the direction we want them to go in a national free market way, which is a great sign that my colleagues across the aisle should love, that we're going, all of our debate is causing free market ideas, and demands for renewables is being met with free enterprise, development of supply without exacerbating our national debt issue. So that should be something that we all like in here, and we all be applauded. We all stand up and all just leave that we're all accomplishing our mission. Ms. Farley, you did say something, and my colleague from California mentioned this a minute ago, which was from my colleague, Mr. Graves, talked about that a bill is more than just the cost per kilowatt hour. And we talked about Massachusetts, who is pushing renewables, that their costs are going up. And Mr. Huffman, I think you said that there are a lot of energy efficient things that are driving up costs. I find it a little bit ironic, and I'd ask you to quote on this, is how when we're driving efficiency, it's costing the individual more. How does that work how does one American people get excited about that?
Thank you. I don't think I understand the question. I did not.
Well, it goes back to the Mr. Chairman, Mr. Lowenthal's question is how do we reconcile what Mr. Hawley said last week, that renewables actually cost Americans more, not less. And so people, I grew up very poor when I was young. I grew up food stamps, so you have to make a decision, do I feed my family or pay my electric bill? And so how do you reconcile when you get more efficient that it costs you more to have energy?
I don't believe that the more efficient you are, that it costs you more money. The whole point of efficiency is to reduce your utility bills.
Well, I was just mentioning what Mr. Huffman said, the more efficient we got, there was
The gentleman
actually,
yield for 5 seconds?
Sure.
It's the difference between unit cost and out-of-pocket cost to the consumer on their bill. The unit cost may go up, but the bill itself does not go up, and in some cases can go down.
But somebody's paying for that, correct? I mean, it's not free. Mr. Mason, can I ask you a question? In your testimony, you state that concerns we have is energy curtails CO2, it increases concentration of other pollutants, such as if you have no wind, you can't have wind energy. If you have no sun, you have no sun energy. So in those times, you have to store it by batteries. There are issues with that. Would you agree that we need to have some analysis on the impact of an environment before we just take off down this road?
Absolutely, though analysis will not get us there. There are going to be substantial uncertainties with regard to the environment and substantial uncertainties with regard to the interaction of different energy products with regard to that environment. A point in case that I made in my written testimony was a trader that posed the electricity exchange in Northern Europe with a €100 million loss in September of 2018, because while Europe was experiencing a drought, Northern Europe, who is based primarily on hydro, experienced excess rainfall. So you can't understand, no matter how much analysis you do, a meteorologist won't tell you what the weather.
Well, no, Dr. Mason, if you don't mind. So we tried to get into the rules so that we had an analysis of impact, economic impact on anything that we did related to the transition, and that rule was struck down, was not allowed to enter into the rules of this Congress, of this committee. So I appreciate everyone being here. It's been a long day, a lot longer than you thought, so thank you for your witness. Now I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of bring the hearing to a close, but I'd like to follow up on something that when Mr. Gosar was the chair of the subcommittee and I was the ranking member, he used to, at the end of the hearing, ask all the panelists if there's one question they would have liked to have been asked and what their answer would be. Now, this is very brief. I'm not asking for another 5. Just what question would you like to have been asked, or we should have, and how would you quickly and simply answer that question? So let's begin again across with the first witness, Ms. Farley. What would you like to have been asked? And if you don't have anything, if you think you've been asked everything, Ms. Farley, that's fine too.
I would have liked to have been asked how we ensure that the same business model used in the fossil fuel industry, which hurts communities, doesn't simply get replaced by the same system that will be used to run the renewable energy industry. And I believe, as many do and have access to data that proves it, that any solution meant to mitigate the impacts of climate change on lower income, under-resourced communities must be centered in equity and must be centered in a reckoning with the reasons that these disparities exist.
Thank you. Ms. Schrader, what question?
The question I would have liked to have been asked is how can Grand Junction be sort of a template for other rural communities in the United States that have diversified to outdoor recreation? And I would say that we in the Grand Valley, we've built a lot of partnerships. The oil and gas industry has supported so much of our trail infrastructure. Our government leaders, from the commissioners in the county to the city officials to our state representatives, have really focused on rebuilding and rebranding our community. And that has, I mean, this has been in a community that has long been really entrenched in oil and gas. And that culture change has created a lot of pride and excitement for the community and for the state. And we are becoming sort of this template for other communities in Colorado, but also in the rural West that have really suffered economically. And, you know, bringing that kind of prosperity back to a community is extremely gratifying, and I hope we can do that across the United States.
Thank you. Dr. Bissett.
Mr. Chairman, it would be very simple. We talk a lot about cost of energy production, but we rarely talk about reliability or, more importantly, scope. And I think the question of scope has to be in there, because when you look at what 100 coal miners can do, or 100 people that are installing solar panels or windmills, you've got to look at that energy produced. And I think a lot of times that's the last thing we talk about. Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Hilly.
Mr. Chair, first, I need to clarify my response to Ms. Cheney's question. I did arrive here by car this morning. I flew to D.C. I wanted to be transparent about that. Wasn't intentionally misleading, but that was going pretty fast. The question that I wish had been asked is, what is the role of the electric utilities in this transition? And the electric utilities can play a transformative positive role, as they have when we've partnered with them for an on-bill financing program for residential energy efficiency, so that the customer pays nothing up front. The utility pays for the retrofit and recovers that investment plus interest from a charge on the customer's bill. They can also play a negative role when they try to reverse statutes that support things like our solar net metering statute in Kentucky. So the role of the utilities is really important. They do have a monopoly on this service, and they need to be held accountable for their role in the transition.
Thank you. Mr. Dennison.
I wish there was more time on the how. The transition is already happening. We've seen the trend in coal employment since the 70s. We need to be into detailed problem solving and have focus on creating opportunity for people in Appalachia and elsewhere. I wish I had time to provide other examples. There's a honey business that is also helping to pollinate reforestation on mine lands. How reforestation of mine lands can contribute to climate change mitigation and create thousands of jobs. And the role of the market. That was a great discussion we almost got to there at the end. Fantastic market innovation, for-profit entrepreneurs with social and environmental triple bottom line, really leading the way.
Thank you. And finally, Dr. Mason.
I think the question would be, do we all believe that all green is clean? Because the answer is no. There are a lot of green arbitrage plays out there. A good example is mining young or cutting down young growth cypress in Louisiana, forests that were devastated years ago, in order to pelletize it and send it on ships over to Europe to burn it as environmentally friendly biofuel over there, encouraged by subsidies. That's just wrong, and there are many other examples. So I think if we can drop the notion that all green is clean, and we need to define our terms to begin with, we can start with that meaningful conversation that you started with today.
Thank you. Thank you for all the panelists, for your valuable testimony, and members for their questions, and for the climate that we created. I think people felt like they were listened to and at least got their chance. I mean, we're just beginning, and I think it was a great beginning. If members of this committee have additional questions for the witnesses, we will ask you to respond to these in writing under Committee Rule 3.0. Members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and then the hearing record will be open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, this committee stands adjourned.
Thank you. You guys too, thank you. Can I please ask you to watch the terms of the solar revenues they'd hoped? Then,
Yeah, we'll talk.
residents.